Hey everyone, Mr. DVB here. So today I'm going to be bringing you guys my ranking for the MCU movies from worst to best. Now this is of course including the newest MCU film, Captain Marvel, which is also the most controversial and at this point probably most hated MCU film in existence. So yeah, let's see how many people we can piss off with this video. Now before I get into this, I don't feel like I should have to mention this, but I usually do, judging by all the comments I usually get on these ranking videos. This is, of course, my opinion, you know? Not everybody shares the exact same opinion on these movies. I'm sure all of you guys have a different ranking than I do, but just because we have different rankings doesn't mean we have to hate each other. Doesn't mean you have to call me stupid and fat, or that you screwed my mom. Like, I get it, that's probably why I'm ugly. But, yeah, let's just talk about... Let's just rank the MCU films as people. And not necessarily agree, but just respect each other's opinions. I know this sounds really stupid, and like I shouldn't have to bring it up, but if you guys check the comments on some of the other rankings I've done in the past, usually it is a good thing to bring up that. With that being said, let's just go right into this. So coming in at number 21 is not Captain Marvel. It is in fact the Incredible Hulk from 2008. So if I have to be completely honest, this is actually the only film in the MCU that I can flat out say that I hate. I really don't like this movie. My biggest issue with it has kind of actually occurred over time, and that is that it just doesn't fit in the MCU. This doesn't feel like it belongs anywhere in this franchise because of the fact that, really, you have a different actor playing Bruce Banner / the Hulk from what we're used to, and then on top of that, you have characters like Betty Brant, who is, you know, the love interest in this movie, who is just not even mentioned or brought up ever again in the rest of the MCU films. Like, it feels like her character doesn't even exist anymore. As a matter of fact, the only real link that this movie has to the other MCU films is General Ross. That's really the only thing about this movie that actually crosses over to the other MCU films, besides like maybe the after credit scene with Tony Stark. So yeah, that's the main reason I don't really like Incredible Hulk. On top of that, I just don't think it's a good movie. I don't think Hulk's a character that necessarily works on his own. And that's why I just think this movie's very forgettable. I think the portrayal given by Edward Norton in this movie isn't really that good in my opinion. I think he's pretty forgettable as the character. I think that Mark Ruffalo does a way better job as this character, delivering like humor and all these different aspects that are just completely devoid of in the performance given by Edward Norton. Hulk obviously doesn't look very good in this movie. I mean, Iron Man came out the same year as this film, and Iron Man CGI still holds up pretty well nowadays. I don't think, you know, the big green Hulk or Abomination hold up very well, and that's my other flaw. Abomination, he's not a good villain. He's just a big CGI slog, and the action sequences in this movie are just, like I said, big CGI slugs, so I don't have much else to say about this movie. There are some scenes I like. I really like the chase in Borneo thing, or Brazil maybe, I don't know where it was, but it occurs near the beginning. I thought that was kind of a cool scene, and I do like seeing Bruce Banner kind of on his own trying to control his temper. There are some aspects in this film like that I do enjoy, but besides those few things, I just think this is a very forgettable film that really doesn't have a footing in the rest of the MCU. Coming in at number 20 is going to be the very first Thor. So I know that a lot of people consider The Dark World to be worse than the first Thor, but I actually consider the first Thor to be worse, and I'm not going to bring up my reason why. I'll mention that when I talk about Thor: The Dark World, but I just think this is another bland and forgettable MCU film. Now, it's nowhere near as bad as Incredible Hulk. I wouldn't even call this movie bad. I would just call it average. I think there are some good things in this movie. I think that Tom Hiddleston as Loki is really good in this movie. I think Asgard looks really cool, and there are some really great, you know, shots in this movie as far as showing us these really cool areas, but I just think this is kind of an average film, to be honest. I mean, it introduces us to Thor. This is kind of before I actually liked Thor as a character. I didn't really start loving Thor until around probably Ragnarok, honestly. I wasn't a big fan of him back then. And you know, in this movie, so yeah, I don't have much to say about this movie besides that. I think the performances are fine overall. I don't think Chris Hemsworth's actually that great in this movie. His performance is kind of iffy in my opinion. I don't think he's bad, but I wouldn't call him good. He's nowhere near as good as in the role as he is now. And yeah, I just think this is kind of an average film. There's not really any memorable action sequences in my opinion. so yeah, it's just kind of an average film. That's really all I think about Thor. Just not one that I kind of love. I think one of the issues I have with this film is that they strip, Thor's powers away from him and just kind of have him as a normal human being who doesn't have his abilities. And the reason I think that's an issue is because that's the kind of thing I think they should save for the second film. I think the first movie should be showing us the character and his abilities, and kind of what he can do. And then the second film is where you kind of take away those abilities and then develop him as a character. I think what they're trying to go for was kind of a reversal there, where they're trying to develop him first. But I just don't think it worked the best because it wasn't a great introduction to the character, and that's kind of where my main issue with this movie comes in. But I know not every person has that, same thought, so whatever. Moving on to number 19, we have Iron Man 2, which a lot of people really don't like this movie. Back in the day, it was considered like the weakest MCU film for a while. And I kind of had that same thought until I rewatched the movie about 2 years ago, and my opinion actually kind of changed. The first half of Iron Man 2, I love. As a matter of fact, I think it's nowhere near as good as the first one, but it is a really decent and worthy sequel. I do think it works as a sequel to the first Iron Man for the first half, but the problem with this movie, it is way overstuffed with subplots. There is way too much going on in this movie. Obviously you have Tony Stark and this whole conflict with him and the character Whiplash, who is a pretty compelling villain, and then you have relationship issues with him and Pepper Potts. You have Nick Fury being introduced with Black Widow, and they're kind of talking about the Avengers Initiative and S.H.I.E.L.D. You have this weird subplot about some chess piece that can, like, fix stuff, and it's like a new, I don't know, element. There's just a lot of subplots. There's, the hammer intersees things. I think you guys get the idea. There's a lot going on in this movie. It was trying to set up for the Avengers, and I think it was way overstuffed with stuff. There's a few things I do love about this movie. Like I said, I think the first half works really well. It was a lot more balanced. It was pretty comedic. It was enjoyable. Robert Downey was still great. Robert Downey Jr., was still great in the role. You have a new actor playing Rhodes, who I think does way better. I like Don Cheadle a lot more than I like Terrence Howard in the role. So there's a lot of pros to be had with this movie. The villain's pretty good. I actually really like Justin Hammer as well as a character. But I do think that Whiplash was kind of forgotten, and then he's just gone for the majority of the movie and shows up again in the final act to kind of just die. So the movie's not perfect, but I do like it. I just think that it was way too overstuffed, and that is why it is being placed this low on my list. So coming in at number 18 is Thor: The Dark World, and this is widely considered to be the worst film in the MCU, until kind of now, I guess, because Captain Marvel exists. Thor: The Dark World. I don't really know where to start with this movie. I actually kind of like this film. I mean, obviously, considering I said that I liked Iron Man 2. What do I like about Thor 2 over the first Thor? Well, first of all, I think it does a way better job at world building. I think one of the things I love about this is that the first Thor, a lot of it takes place on Earth, in this kind of sandy, deserty area, and we don't get to see much of Asgard and all these other 9 realms that exist. It's kind of just on Earth for the majority of the film. So I liked that this film, for the majority of it, took place on these different planets, kind of showing us more of the planets that exist in the MCU, kind of expanding the universe. And I will admit that the story is kind of weaker, the villain is extremely forgettable, and there are issues like that with this movie. But I think from a world-building standpoint, it's better than the first one. I think Thor as a character is better in this than he was in the first one. So there is pros to be had with this movie. I don't think it's as bad as everybody thinks it is. I do think there is a lot to like about this movie, but I do understand where a lot of people don't like this film when it comes to things like the villain and the story, which just feels kind of forgettable overall. Loki in this movie, I'll be honest, this is actually my favorite portrayal of Loki in any films, kind of tied with Thor Ragnarok, I guess, because I love the banter between Thor and Loki in this movie. In the other films, I honestly don't really like Loki as a villain that much. I mean, I still think his performance is great in the original Thor and the Avengers, but I like him a lot more when they're kind of just brothers who have this kind of annoying banter between each other. I think that's more enjoyable, because I don't take Loki as being this, extremely evil guy in these movies, so that's just an element that was kind of introduced in The Dark World that I really, really enjoy. And, because of that, I think it's a better film than the first one. I know a lot of people would disagree with that, but that's fine. Just don't, kill me. Moving on to number 17 is Captain America: The First Avenger. So this is actually the very first film I saw, the very first MCU film I saw in theaters. I think I would have been about 9 or so. And At the time, I thought it was great. My opinions on it have kind of changed over time. I don't think it's as good anymore. One of my problems with this movie kind of happens like midway through, and it's kind of a random flaw, but it is something that's always annoyed me. But first of all, the pros. I think Chris Evans is great in this role. I love the World War II setting. I think that's probably the best thing about this movie, is just the setting. I love the feeling of the 1940s, seeing all these really iconic, locations and clothing. These really awesome vehicles and stuff. It's just cool. I like that military, army setting that we see in this movie. I like the characters. I think Red Skull's a really cool-looking villain. I don't think he's really that great of a character, but I do think he's kind of a cool-looking villain. And there's just some stuff in this movie that I really like. I think it's a good World War II comic book movie. So my flaw that I was going to mention is kind of really rushed feeling this movie is, and it's kind of like about halfway through there's this scene where instead of showing Captain America kind of getting stronger and becoming a better character, they just show like a 2-minute montage of him just going around and taking down Hydra bases and just like winning, and then you see Red Skull and he's like, dang it, he got us again. And it's just like this 2-minute montage that comes out of nowhere. And there could have been some cool moments in there because it kind of just goes from, him getting his abilities and he's kind of a better character and he doesn't even have his suit yet, to just, oh yeah, they just defeated like 90% of Hydra and he has a suit now. It just kind of comes out of nowhere, and it feels like there was a huge section there that was just rushed and kind of skipped over. And that's my flaw with this movie. And I know it's a really random flaw to bring up, but it's just true. Another thing that I think is very underlooked or overlooked, I don't know what the right term would be there, when it comes to Captain America the First Avenger, is the relationship between Peggy and Cap. I think it is probably the most realistic and believable relationship out of any of the MCU characters, in my opinion. They just work really well together, and that is an aspect that I love of the First Avenger that not many people really talk about. I think the correct term is overlooked. So yeah, Captain America the First Avenger. Pretty good movie overall. The action sequences are kind of forgettable in my opinion, but as a movie, I like it. Moving on to number 16 is Avengers Age of Ultron, and that still shocks me today to hear those words coming out of my mouth, because I was so hyped for this movie back when it was coming out in 2015. It was like one of my most hyped movies of all time. I was huge into the MCU at the time. I'm still now, but that was when I was younger and I was like so invested with superheroes and everything. So I was so hyped for this movie, and it really disappointed me back then. I remember coming out of the theater just like kind of thinking, it was good, but it wasn't great. And that's kind of how I feel about it now. I think it's a good film. I just don't think it's great. I think the biggest issue for me and a lot of people was Ultron. Now, I still think he's a good character overall in this movie, but he was so much weaker than he could have been. He was so much weaker than he should have been. He could have been this really creepy and kind of scary badass character like he was portrayed as being in the trailers, but instead, he's making jokes about omelets and stuff, and I just remember sitting in the theater and going like, what the hell happened? Like, this was supposed to be a dark and creepy character. I remember seeing in the trailers like Captain America's broken shield, and you're like, holy shit, is people gonna die? And looking back on it now, this movie just feels so forgettable in the grand scheme of MCU films. You look at Infinity War, everybody's talking about Infinity War. People still bring up the first Avengers because it has some moments in there that actually kind of do matter now. Like, you have the Battle of New York, which is still brought up all the time. I don't think anybody really cares about Sokovia anymore. Everything that happens in Age of Ultron just feels kind of forgettable compared to the first Avengers. And now, like, in the grand scheme of the MCU, the movie just kind of feels like it's left behind. You have characters like Quicksilver who are introduced and then killed off like that, which was really disappointing, even though I don't think the character was good at all. He just kind of dies. Scarlet Witch was introduced. I don't like her in this movie, but I think she's a great character now. But back then, she was fine. So, yeah, I don't know. This movie for me is just kind of somewhere in the middle of the MCU. Well, not really. It's actually near the bottom, but still. Not a great movie in my opinion. Pretty disappointing film overall, but not a bad movie. I still think there's things to be liked about this movie. I like the group banter. The action sequences are great. You have some epic moments like the Hulkbuster fight, which will just go down in history as being one of the coolest fights in a comic book movie. But yeah, as a whole, just not that great in my opinion. Coming in at number 15 is Iron Man 3. So, again, a movie that people would probably put a lot lower on their list. But nonetheless, once again, it's a little bit higher for me. Iron Man 3. Now, obviously, my biggest flaw with this movie, I probably don't even have to mention. You guys already know what it is. It's, of course, the Mandarin and that whole dumb twist that they did. That still annoys me to this day. That was a huge wasted potential. And, like, the thing is, characters in the MCU, in my opinion, don't have to be comic book accurate. They don't have to be the perfect representation of their characters. I didn't need to have Mandarin have all those little power rings. You know, if he was this really kind of creepy terrorist on television, played by whoever it was, Ben Kingsley, I would have been fine with that because he seemed menacing, he seemed threatening. But they just take that and they throw it out the window for this extremist idea where you have this other character taking over the role. And what can I say? Guy Pearce in this movie sucks. I think he is a very forgettable and lame MCU villain. What's his name again? Like Adrian Pierce or something? I don't remember. I think that's a character from Watch Dogs. But yeah, he sucks as a villain in my opinion. He's one of the worst in the MCU because he just was so unnecessary. And you know, they tried to make this new character who, you know, is supposed to have some, not beef, but kind of like history with Tony Stark. But the problem is that was never shown before, so they're kind of explaining his backstory in this like big expositional scene. And there's just things like that I just don't like about Iron Man 3. But besides that, those like two flaws, I think everything else in this movie is great. I love that Tony doesn't have his suit for much of this movie. I think that's a flaw that some people have with this film, but the reason I like it, like I said earlier, is because he's had the suits for the other two movies. We've seen him as Iron Man. It's time to see him as Tony Stark and build him as that character. And that's what I like about Iron Man 3. Like I said, I just think if Thor had done that instead, I think that, you know, the first Thor would have been a better movie, and the first Iron Man is a great movie. So I think that the MCU kind of did a little bit wrong with the Thor movies, but nonetheless, here we are with Iron Man 3. I like it. I think the humor's good. I think the action's pretty good overall. I like the characters. I like all of the suits. I just think it's a fun and entertaining movie. More entertaining than the second, in my opinion, and it's just a good film overall. So there you go, Iron Man 3. Moving on to number 14, we have Ant-Man and the Wasp, which is the second newest film in the MCU. So when I originally saw this movie, my initial thoughts were that it was an average film. I didn't really have that much that I liked about it. I thought it was just pretty straight in the middle, generic MCU film that in the grand scheme of things, especially with Avengers Endgame coming out less than a year later, that it was going to be forgotten. It was a pretty forgettable MCU film. And that's kind of where my stance is on it now. I have watched it again recently, and I actually did like the movie a little bit more on rewatch. I would say that it's good at this point. I wouldn't say it's great, but I would say it's a good movie. I'd give it like a solid 7 out of 10. There are aspects I really enjoy. I thought that Evangeline Lilly was really good as the Wasp. I like her character a lot more than I did in the first Ant-Man. She was kind of average there. Here, she's given a lot more to do. She has more time in the spotlight, obviously, as she's, you know, in the title. So I really liked her character in this movie. I don't think she was, like, you know, given enough to do, like, you know, to be the big star of this movie, but I still liked her. I thought that her relationship with Paul Rudd's character was great, so I really liked their banter that they had in this movie. Scott Lang was, you know, he's a funny character. Paul Rudd basically just plays himself in these movies, which I'm fine with because, you know, he's got a likable personality, so I really enjoy him. I think his daughter Cassie, she's good in the movie. She's pretty funny. I like their relationship as well. Hank Pym is really good as well. He's, you know, a pretty great character in this film, and I like the storyline overall, the idea of them trying to, like, go into the quantum realm and save Janet. I like that storyline. That's one of the things I like about the Ant-Man films is they're not necessarily about saving the world from some, like, intergalactic, you know, threat. They're just more laid-back, smaller-scale storylines, no pun intended, you know, and in this case, it's literally just saving someone from some quantum realm. So I do like the storyline in this movie. I think it works quite well, and that's kind of where the positives end for me. With the negatives, obviously, you know, as per usual with an MCU film, the villain's really weak. Ghost was really disappointing for me because she looked really cool in the trailer. She came across as menacing. She had these really interesting abilities, and I just feel like they did not utilize her character well enough. She came across as socially awkward, which I get what they were trying to do there, but it just didn't work for me. It felt kind of weird, and I didn't enjoy her scenes. She could have been this menacing and intimidating, you know, physical threat, and I just didn't get that from her. You know, she's supposed to be like this assassin, and I really don't see that in any of the sequences. So, yeah, I thought she was a pretty weak villain. On top of that, I really don't like the subplot with, like, Walton Goggins' character and his group of, like, you know, rich guys who are trying to steal the lab. that just felt out of place and kind of tacked on for me. And then you have Scotty's friend, Michael Pena's character, whose name has kind of slipped my mind. Him and all of his friends, like, you know, those hackers and whatnot, they just feel randomly thrown in here. They kind of came out of nowhere. In the first film, you know, they had to do something with the story because, you know, they were working on doing this heist, and they all had attributes that would be useful towards the, you know, heist itself. So they had a place in the first movie. They have no place in this film. They are just here because they were funny in the first one, and, you know, for fan service, they wanted to throw them back in, but their sequences feel out of place, and they kind of take away from the pacing of the movie. It slows it down to a halt sometimes, and I just didn't think any of their scenes were comedic. They felt very tacked on and forced. So yeah, that was another flaw. And kind of my last flaw is the action sequences. The action in this movie is pretty forgettable for the most part. In the first Ant-Man, you have a lot of these really cool sequences where, you know, Ant-Man will be shrinking to the size of an ant, and you'll have these really awesome moments like when he's in the bathtub, and what normally we just see as, like, you know, a little bit of water coming out of the faucet, to him is like a freaking tidal wave. So the way they played with the size in the first movie was really cool. You have the final fight where they're fighting on the Thomas the Train Engine toy, which was really hilarious and funny. In Ant-Man and the Wasp, they really don't use, like, the size idea that much. There's a few moments, you know, like when they're doing the car chase, they shrink the car, which was kind of cool. But besides that and a few other things, there's not really any, like, you know, moments where they're, like, super small and you're getting these really cool perspective shots and that kind of stuff. So that was an aspect I was disappointed by. They did not incorporate that into the action at all. So, yeah, overall, Ant-Man and the Wasp, it has great visuals. That whole Pez part, that thing looked so real. The lighting on that was amazing. The Quantum Realm's pretty cool. Doesn't look as cool as it could have, though, mainly because of the fact that, you know, Doctor Strange happened, and that looked very similar to Doctor Strange, so yeah. But overall, Ant-Man and the Wasp, I think it's an okay MCU film. I would just say it's average. I would actually swap this with Iron Man 3. I do like Iron Man 3 more than this film, I'd say. And one more thing I also want to change is I earlier said that Age of Ultron was a good movie, not a great film. No, I would say that Age of Ultron is an average, okay film. So moving on to number 13, we have Spider-Man Homecoming, and this is a choice that's probably going to annoy a lot of people, and I can understand why. Spider-Man is like my second favorite superhero of all time. I love him as a character. He is so great, and when I first saw this movie in theaters, I practically gave it a 10. I thought it was fantastic. We were finally seeing this realistic high school version of Peter Parker, seeing his life at school with his friends and everything. It was very enjoyable. You had Michael Keaton as the Vulture, who was very intimidating and creepy. All of his scenes were fantastic. He looked awesome. So there's a lot of things going for this movie that I think turned out fantastic. And it wasn't until I rewatched the movie that I realized its biggest pro was also its biggest con, and that is the amount of screen time given to Peter Parker and his high school life. I think this is something they could have kind of toned down a bit, because that was like all this movie was, really. It's a lot of Peter Parker at school, and there's kind of a lack of Spider-Man moments. It wasn't like a 50-50 split. It's more like a 70-30 in my opinion. There's not that much Spider-Man stuff in this movie, and the Spider-Man stuff that is there is pretty forgettable. There's no epic web-slinging scene. There's no big epic fight sequences between Spider-Man and the Vulture. There's barely any, honestly. There's the fairy fight, which lasts like 10 seconds. So there's no fight sequences in this movie that were memorable, which was, you know, a big disappointment, because Spider-Man is, like, you know, one of the coolest characters in the MCU. He should have some of the best fight sequences, and he's given some of the most forgettable. So that was an aspect that just really disappointed me. There was a lot of things in this movie I also didn't like to do with the characters. Now, I know some people are fine with them changing some stuff over time. I know I said earlier, characters don't have to be 100% accurate. But when you have, like, Flash as, like, this really scrawny kid who's actually shorter than Peter Parker's actor in real life, to me, that just doesn't make sense. And, like, there's the whole MJ thing, which really annoys me. So there's a lot of stuff like that they're changing to me that just, I don't understand why. So yeah, Spider-Man Homecoming, overall, I think it's a decent film. I would say it's between decent and good, like around a 7 and a 7.5 out of 10. I'd say it's good. I just think that there's way too much Peter Parker stuff in this movie, not enough Spider-Man, and let's talk about Vulture for a second. Like I said, he looks badass, he is badass, but there's one flaw with his character, and that's that he's kind of underused in my opinion. Like I said, there's no big fight with him and Spider-Man. When he's on screen, he looks so cool, and, you know, the sound effects that play when he's flying, it sounds amazing, but, like, there just should have been more of him in the movie. I felt like he wasn't, like, used enough for, like, who he is, so I'm hoping that Far From Home really improves on the villain aspect and gives us a lot more action sequences, and ones that we can remember. On to number 12, we have Doctor Strange, which is the only MCU film between Captain America the First Avenger and Captain Marvel that I actually didn't see in theaters. I eventually did watch this movie, though, and I really enjoyed it. I thought that this was a very fun MCU film, a really great introduction to a brand new character. I thought Benedict Cumberbatch was fantastic in the role, very similar to Tony Stark, like, this arrogant rich guy, except whereas I'd say Tony Stark is more of just kind of a lovable jerk, this guy's more of an actual straight-up jerk. Like, he is very rude, and that was an aspect I actually really liked about his character. It kind of made you dislike him at first, and then over the course of the movie, there's some character growth, and you're kind of seeing him becoming more of a likable person. So that was an aspect I really liked. I think there was some good characterization there. Obviously, the visual effects in this movie are just fantastic. It's really mind-blowing. There's so much, beautiful colors, vibrant, contrasty. The movie looks fantastic. So this definitely is like a visual effects showcase film to watch. Very nice looking. Reminds me a lot of Inception with all these mind-bendy moments. So it was really cool. And the side characters were pretty interesting. I really liked the Ancient One. Christina was a good character. But the weakest aspect for me, as per usual with MCU films, has to be the villain. I think Celsius, or whatever his name is, was really a lame character, honestly. He doesn't have much dialogue at all. He's kind of just there sometimes. And yeah, he was just very uninteresting. And then Dormammu, well, that final scene with Dormammu is pretty funny. It feels like lazy writing in a way to me, because, this guy really wants to just, devour Earth. He wants to destroy it, and he just decides to give up because, Doctor Strange can do something with time. It felt like kind of lazy writing, honestly. And I get, they couldn't just have him defeat Dormammu, because that wouldn't really be easy. But, I don't know, it just felt kind of out of place to me, and it just felt kind of lazy. But still, besides that, my biggest other issue, actually this is my biggest issue, is that the film feels kind of rushed. And there's a specific point that I always bring up, and it's when, Doctor Strange is trying to, cast a spell, and he can barely do it. There's, flickering, he's giving up, he's like, I can't do this. And then 15 minutes later, he's in the Sanctum Sanctorum, taking on Celsius, and he wins. He throws that metal thing on there, and he wins the fight. He beats the main villain of the movie 15 minutes after he couldn't even conjure up a spell. It's so rushed. It just feels like they skipped over, a good 20 minutes of, practicing and stuff. And I know that could sound kind of boring, so, there's two things they could have done. They could have extended the movie to 2 hours, because it's only an hour and 40, and they could have used some of that time to kind of develop his skills more, and then also use that time to develop the villain more. Do both of those things, the movie would have been better because of that. So I think that's something that this movie could have fixed and kind of improved on. But, well, it's just an issue I've always kind of had with this film. But I know not everyone's going to agree with that, so whatever. But yeah, overall, really like this movie. I think it's a very fun MCU film. On to number 11, we have the original Ant-Man from 2015. So, like I said earlier, I really like these smaller scale, again, no pun intended, storylines to these movies. This one is a heist film. They're trying to stop this, corporate guy from getting this suit so he can sell it to the military and kind of have this new militarized small suit called the Yellow Jacket. So Paul Rudd, who is a criminal, or Paul Rudd playing Scott Lang, who is a criminal, teams up with Hank Pym so he can break into this place with all of his friends, and they can steal this suit and everything. It's an interesting storyline. I really like it. I like that the main character is a criminal. That was kind of a fun idea. I like seeing his, criminal life and that kind of stuff. The movie's humor was pretty good. I think that's an aspect that the second Ant-Man film kind of was wishy-washy on, was the humor. It didn't work all the time. This film, the humor mostly lands, in my opinion. There's some really funny moments. I love the performance given by Paul Rudd in this film. I think Hank Pym is fantastic. I really like their relationship. Like I said earlier, I think Evangeline Lilly in this movie is kind of stale for me. She's still good at acting in this film. I just don't really like her character as much as I do in the in the second film, because there she's actually a hero and stuff, and she's doing a lot. Here she's kind of working with the villain sometimes. And I didn't really enjoy her character moments, so I like her a lot more in the second film. And yeah, my biggest praise for this film over the second one is they incorporate the shrinking idea way more, and it makes sense as the first film when you're introducing this character. But yeah, that's just an aspect the second film really disappointed me on. So I love all these sequences when he's shrinking, taking on the villain, throwing the Thomas the Train Engine at him. Very funny. There was a lot of really great humorous moments. The villain in the film, I think is actually decent. I don't think he's like as bad as a lot of people think he is. I think when he's just regular Darren Cross, he's actually kind of intimidating sometimes. So I did like that. I think once he becomes the Yellow Jacket, he actually looks really cool. And yeah, so he's an alright villain in my opinion. He's definitely like nowhere near like as good as characters like Killmonger or Thanos. Like he's not even on the same level as those guys. But in the grand scheme of the MCU, I would say he's like, somewhere in the middle. He's a pretty decent villain. So yeah, there you go. Those are my thoughts on the very first Ant-Man. On to number 10, we finally have the new controversial Captain Marvel. Now, like I said earlier, this video is my opinion, and a thing I try to do when I am reviewing movies and giving my thoughts on them is not let my personal feelings for what somebody said or anything like that kind of affect my thoughts on a movie. So, like, there are times where I have disagreed with people in the past on things, like what actors might say or something like that, but I can still appreciate a movie for what it is. Like, for example, because Harvey Weinstein's like this groper, that kind of stuff, that doesn't mean I hate all of the movies that he produced. I still think Quentin Tarantino's movies are fantastic. Like, that doesn't change my perception of those movies. I know that's a really weird-ass thing to bring up, but, yeah, so my point is, like, just because Brie Larson said something stupid doesn't mean I hate her movie, and I don't. I thought that Captain Marvel was actually great. Now, there are flaws in this movie for sure. There were things in this movie that I think were not good. For example, I thought that the first, 30 minutes or so were kind of slow and mediocre. They weren't really that great, in my opinion. And then there were, other things in the movie as well. Brie Larson was a little bit stale at times. I don't think she was great in this movie. So yeah, there were flaws with this film for sure, but I just really liked the setting, this 90s, LA, which I love, by the way. I'm so glad this didn't take place in New York once again. I'm just so tired of seeing the same area over and over again, so I like that we were getting a different place for once in a while. The space sequences were pretty cool. The movie's visuals, for the most part, were nice. There were some iffy effects, but that's kind of, to be expected. And yeah, I don't know, I just thought this was a really, really fun adventure movie. I thought Goose the Cat, stole all the scenes that he was in, or she, whatever it was. Samuel Jackson was fantastic in this movie. Like I said in my review, I actually think this is his best performance as the character because he's always really serious in his role, and while I love him in the other films, it was kind of cool to see him as this more lighthearted character, and I just like that kind of buddy cop feel that this movie has. There was a good kick-ass 90s soundtrack. I don't think they incorporated enough 90s songs, but there were some good 90s songs in there, some good Nirvana, so I like that. I just thought this was a really fun buddy cop, adventure movie. The action sequences were kind of forgettable as well. They weren't like Spider-Man Homecoming forgettable, but they weren't the best. They were kind of close up and shaky cam looking, so I wasn't a huge fan of the way they were filmed. But yeah, overall, an enjoyable movie. I thought the Skrulls looked fantastic. The makeup effects for the Skrulls were great. I thought that the main villain, I can't remember his name, he was terrible. He was very lackluster and forgettable. But Talos, played by Ben Mendelsohn, who is, I don't consider him the villain if you guys have seen the movie. I thought he was great. I really liked his character. And yeah, so overall, I enjoyed Captain Marvel. I know that is not the general consensus. And it's fine if you guys disagree with me. Like I said earlier, just try to be polite about it. I don't want some huge argument going on in the comments just because I liked a movie that you didn't. I mean, it's a movie, guys. I could say that your opinion is wrong as well, but I'm not because I'm not a jerk. Alright, moving on to number 9, we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. So when this movie was first released, I liked it, but I didn't love it. I was a little bit disappointed. I think that my issue was that it felt a little bit messy. I think the storyline was a little bit all over the place. There was a little bit too much going on in this movie, and I still have that feeling, but I have liked it more over time. First of all, I think the characters in this movie are great. I love Star-Lord, I love Gamora, I love everybody's relationship. Drax is hilarious in the movie. He, steals the show. Very funny character. And there's a lot of great character moments in this movie. I think the storyline is a little bit weak in some ways because it kind of feels eventless. You have them meeting Ego, and they're kind of just walking around on this planet for a little bit, and then stuff goes down. So it just kind of felt like there was nothing really going on for a while. I'm not a big fan of Nebula's character at all, so I didn't really like whenever she would show up in the movie. She's always just kind of annoyed me personally. But I do love Ego as a villain. I want to just talk about this. I think he is one of the more, kind of overlooked, or I still don't know. I think it's overlooked. He's one of the more overlooked MCU villains. People don't talk about him that much. And I think he's a great villain because he was intimidating. And it was a pretty cool, it wasn't really a twist, but that I liked that he ended up being the main villain of the movie. I like that over the gold people who were kind of lame. And the twist, obviously, that got everyone was the fact that he was responsible for killing Star-Lord's mother. That was a huge shocker. That was a really cool scene, so I love that moment when Peter just goes ballistic on him and starts shooting him up. Like, that was really awesome. So this movie had some great character moments. I like the development of these characters. Yondu was also fantastic in this movie. Rip, his death was very sad, but yeah, he was a great character, and I really like his moments with Rocket and their kind of team up. I just wasn't a huge fan of the way the characters kind of split up. I'm not a huge fan like when these groups kind of separate for like a big portion of the movie. So yeah, there was a few flaws in the movie for sure. I don't think the humor always landed, but it mostly did. And I think the first 40 minutes or so were a little bit iffy. So the film did take a while to find its footing, but once it did, it was a blast, and I think the movie is, overall, a really great MCU film. Alright, on to number 8, we have Black Panther. So when I first saw this, I actually believe I had it like number 1 on my ranking. I love this movie. I thought it was epic. It was just an amazing theater experience, sitting down, watching this movie. And I think one of the best things about this film is the setting. I mean, Wakanda was so amazing. You have these really, luxurious, majestic lands filled with, grass and, huge mountains. This big bombastic soundtrack that's playing over top of the movie with these drums and chanting and stuff. The movie was just, it had a lot of heart, and it had a lot of I guess you could call it culture in it, and that was something I really liked. It was really cool seeing this culture and everything, and that was definitely the aspect I love the most about this movie. There was amazing set design, amazing costume design. I love all these different costumes and the way they looked, so they did a really good job with that. Now there are flaws with this movie. I do think it's a little bit kind of slower paced. There are some times the movie can kind of drag on a bit. I think T'Challa as a protagonist is a little bit forgettable, honestly. He's kind of dull. He's not the most likable character in the movie for sure. I think that Killmonger was a great villain. I wasn't a fan of how sometimes he acted too gangstery. Some of his dialogue was pretty bad, and some of the acting was a little bit off in my opinion. I found my daddy with panther claws in his chest. There was lines like that I were yeah, it's kind of bad, but he was really intimidating, and the fight sequences, the action in this movie was really good. The CGI, not so good. There were some really bad effects in this movie, especially during the final act, but I don't know, like I said, I think Wakanda was just such a cool setting, and it was just, again, it was good to get out of that typical New York setting and get into this huge, amazing landscape of Wakanda. So, yeah, overall, Black Panther, I think it's a great film. I have a ton of fun with this movie. I do think it's a little bit slower, but I do think that there is just so much amazing stuff in this film to love. So there you go. On to number 7, we have the film that started it all, the original Iron Man, all the way back from 2008. So I actually used to find this movie overrated. I don't know why. I just used to not really care for it too much. And, over the past few years, every single time I watch it, I just love it more and more. And I think what makes me come back to this movie to watch it again and again is Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark. He is just lightning in a bottle in this film. He is fantastic. He steals the show. Such a great character. His performance is absolutely fantastic in this movie. Obadiah Stane is actually one of the better MCU villains, and he's the very first villain in the whole franchise. I actually think he was a compelling villain, honestly. He was really good in his scenes. I liked the portrayal that was given by Jeff Bridges, who I think is a fantastic actor. He was just fantastic in this movie as Ironmonger. The suit looks awesome. I mean, it was a really cool final fight, so I like those aspects about this movie. As I said earlier when I was talking about Incredible Hulk, I think the CGI in this movie holds up for the most part. Obviously, there's some iffy points, but it still holds up really well for an 11-year-old movie. So I think in the end, this is a fantastic film. It started one of my favorite franchises of all time, so I gotta give it props for that. And I just think it's a really fun movie with, again, a very kick-ass soundtrack. There's some great music in here, and yeah, there's not really any characters in this movie that I dislike. Everybody here, does stuff in this movie, and they're all likable. So great film. Yeah, I'd go as far as saying that it's an excellent film. It's that good. On to number 6, we have Thor Ragnarok, the third Thor movie that finally got it right. I don't think any of the other two previous Thor movies were necessarily great, And then this one came along, and it just proved everybody wrong. Thor can have a great movie, and this was the film that gave it to us. Now, as I said earlier, Thor was always like one of my least favorite Avenger characters. I just always found him to be kind of annoying and a little bit stupid at times, and I know that was kind of done for humorous reasons, but I thought it was a little bit overdone. And it wasn't until Ragnarok that I actually began to love his character. I mean, he is fantastic in this movie. He's a lot stronger in this as a character than he was in the previous movies. It feels like there's more like emotional depth given to him. I love, the banter with him and Loki in this movie. It's another highlight, just like it was in Thor: The Dark World. It's something that I think works very well here. I like the, setting of this movie. I thought it was really cool, like, seeing this really weird planet where they're, like, having this gladiator match with Hulk. Speaking of Hulk, Hulk has always been a really weak character in my opinion. Not from a physical standpoint, but from, like, a character standpoint. I just always found him kind of, like, big, and, that's really all he is. He's just this big green guy that destroys things. And this movie actually made me really like Hulk as a character. I think this is kind of the MCU film that made me think, like, hey, maybe Hulk could have his own MCU film and it could work possibly. Because, yeah, I just think Hulk worked really well here. And this was definitely, like, it made him a main character, which he never really was. He was always kind of like the side Avenger. So, here, he was great in my opinion. So that is just something that I think they did very well on. Hela as the villain. Now, I think she's a little bit overrated. I don't think she's one of the best MCU villains out there. I do think she's pretty good, though, but I just wouldn't say she's, like, amazing or anything. My biggest issue with Ragnarok is that the whole Ragnarok event feels kind of like a side story almost, because the majority of this film is, about him and Hulk trying to get off this planet. And while the reason they're trying to get off it is obviously they can go stop Ragnarok, because that's happening, Ragnarok was never on my mind, because the film would kind of just awkwardly cut back to Asgard, where you'd have these sequences, so it kind of just made the editing a little bit weird in my opinion. The movie kind of, like, was a little bit paced weird. It was paced kind of, like, off in my opinion. It would just kind of switch between sequences, and I thought that was a little bit jarring, but, it's not a huge issue in the long run, because I still think this is just such a great space adventure movie. The humor is fantastic. This movie is hilarious. It's really epic. You have an amazing soundtrack. Led Zeppelin playing in the background when he jumps down and he finally, like, unleashes his power. That is my favorite moment in this movie. It's like everybody's favorite moment. When he jumps down and he doesn't even need his hammer. He just electrocutes all those guys. That is such an epic sequence. So, yeah, this is a badass film. I love it. It is an amazing movie, and it's one of my favorite comic book films of all time. It's that damn good. Alright, on to number 5, we have Captain America: The Winter Soldier. So this is considered by many to actually be one of the best MCU films, and, I mean, it's my number 5, so obviously I consider it that great as well. Yeah, I think this is a fantastic film. I mean, the first Captain America, like I said, I love the World War II setting, and I thought that Chris Evans was really good in the role. But the movie had issues with pacing, it had issues with its story sometime, and it had kind of a lackluster villain. I think this film improved on all of those aspects. Now, the villain played by Robert Redford, he's not great in my opinion, but for, like, a villain who doesn't have any abilities and is kind of just like a generic guy, he's actually not that bad in this movie. I do like him. Winter Soldier, if you consider him the main villain, then yeah, sure, this movie has a fantastic villain. I think Winter Soldier is badass. I love the conflict, Bucky being confused. The fight sequences in this movie. The Russo bros choreograph their fights so well. They have, like, these amazing quick cuts. It doesn't seem like it's over the top or anything. It doesn't remind me of, like, Taken 3. It's well filmed. Like, it feels like you're in the action. So they know how to do their action. I guess that's what I'm getting at. They know what they're doing, and they just work it very, very well. So action sequences in this are fantastic. I actually think Black Widow in this is probably the best portrayal of Black Widow we've seen. I don't know what it is. I just really like the way she works as a character in this. I think whenever you take these characters who are kind of more side characters, and then you give them a bigger role, it develops them and then it makes them a more likable character. So I think Black Widow actually works a lot better in this movie than she does in any of the other MCU films. Captain America is obviously great in this film. The only aspect that's missing from this, obviously, is the fantastic setting, because this does just basically take place in, like, Washington, D.C. You're not having, like, this great, like, oh yeah, I love this, like, World War II setting. It kind of just feels like a generic modern-day city, but it's not, like, a huge con, because it's just the setting. I mean, everything else in this movie is, like, bloody fantastic, so I'm just rambling on. Yeah, it's a great movie, and I'd say it's a masterpiece. I don't know if I'd say it's a masterpiece. There are some things that I think aren't the best, but it's a damn good movie, and it introduces us to Falcon, so that's great. Moving on to number 4, we have the Avengers. So the Avengers, for me, over the years, has gone from being a really good movie to being a fantastic film. I don't know what it is. I just love this movie nowadays. I don't think it's necessarily the best directed film in the MCU, because when I watch it, it kind of feels like a high-budget TV movie, and I don't know how to explain that. It's just when they're running around in New York, there's something about it that's always felt kind of off to me, like the way it looks. I think it's just back then they didn't really color grade their movies very well, and, you know, just the enemies and stuff, like the way that Chitauri look when they're fighting, it didn't, like, look super professional. I know that's a weird thing. I've just kind of always had that feeling in the back of my mind, but what works well about this movie is the team. The team is brought together. These characters were all developed. They were given like their own movies, so they had all of their like elements going into the movie, unlike other franchises which just rush their superhero film. DC. So it was great having all these characters team up for the first time in cinema and coming together. It's epic. You have a fantastic soundtrack by Alan Silvestri. I love the main score. It is one of the most memorable comic book scores in my opinion. That big bombastic score, just hearing like the dun 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 dun. I'm not gonna sing it because it's cringy, but still, it sounds amazing. This movie is great. Loki is a really good villain. Like I said, I like him more when he is a, you know, like kind of a mysterious behind the scenes kind of character, but he still works very well as a villain. I mean, there's no doubt about it. He is a really good villain in this movie. So yeah, great film overall. Love the characters. This introduced us to Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk, and obviously he's fantastic in these movies. Way better than Edward Norton and Eric Bana, I think was the guy from like 2003 Hulk. Better than both of them combined, honestly. So yeah, really great movie overall. Good action sequences. Just a very fun film. On to number 3, we have Captain America Civil War. So Civil War, you know, introduced us to so much. It gave us the like most epic fight sequence in, I'd say, Marvel history, the airport battle, seeing all these heroes that we've loved over the, like, you know, the course of the past like 8 years come together and fight each other, introduce us to new characters like Spider-Man and Black Panther taking on each other. You know, Bucky's finally realizing who he is and he's becoming a hero rather than a villain. Like, so much stuff goes down in this movie, and unlike Age of Ultron, which I don't think handled that stuff well, this movie handles every new aspect perfectly, because the Russo bros know what they're doing. The storyline for this movie is great. The action sequences are fantastic. Everything about this movie works extremely well in my opinion. All the characters are great. I like how this kind of feels like Avengers 2.5 almost, as well as being a Captain America movie. I really love these moments where you have Tony and you know, Captain America having conflict with each other. It works very, very well. The only aspect of this movie that I kind of am not the biggest fan of would honestly just have to be the villain, Baron Zemo, because Baron Zemo in the comics, obviously, I think of him as this guy who wears like a pink mask, who has a sword, and he's really cool. And then here, they kind of just slap him in and call him Baron Zemo, so we're like, oh, we know who that is. And it's not that I dislike what he does in the movie. What he does in the movie is really good. I like that whole twist, you know, with Bucky being the person that killed Iron Man's parents. That's a fantastic moment in the movie, a really big, shocking twist. I don't really like Baron Zemo, how they used Baron Zemo as that character, because it just felt a little bit kind of like, you know, what's the word, fan servicey. So that's really my only gripe with the movie. It's not even a big thing at all, honestly. It's just something that kind of bugs me. But other than that, this is a masterpiece. From here on out, these films are pretty much masterpieces in my opinion. Alright, on to number 2, we have Guardians of the Galaxy. This movie honestly blew my mind back in 2014. Even though I was a huge MCU fan at the time, I thought that this movie looked kind of bad. I don't know what it was. When I saw the trailers, I just kind of questioned it. I was like, okay, I don't even know who this group is, first of all, and I don't know why we're getting a movie on them. Like, it just didn't look good, honestly. I didn't know what to expect, and then the movie got really good reviews, and I was like, okay, maybe Guardians of the Galaxy is actually good. So I saw it, and I loved it. This movie was just so damn funny. It is by far the funniest film in the MCU, in my opinion. James Gunn just nailed the humor. The action sequences were really awesome. I love the space setting in this movie, finally expanding the universe even more, showing us all these really cool planets. It was just a great adventure, and I love the group. They didn't need to have their, like, you know, own set-up movies. They just came together, and they were all great characters. They all had things about them that were likable. They were all very funny. I love Star-Lord. I love Rocket. I love Groot. I love Gamora. I love Drax. They're all fantastic characters. So this movie nailed like almost every aspect except for the villain, really. Ronan's the only weak point in this movie for me. Don't like him as a villain. He's pretty forgettable. But, you know, like I said, whereas, you know, for me, like, Civil War didn't really have any issues, and this movie technically has one, I still prefer this movie overall just because of the humor, and, yeah, so there you go. Guardians of the Galaxy, great movie. Finally, coming in at number 1, we have the big bad movie. It's, well, big great movie, actually, but whatever. Avengers Infinity War. What can I say? First of all, when I saw this movie, I actually didn't love it. I thought it was good, but I didn't love it. I gave it like a 7.5 in my review. I don't know what it was at the time. I was not disappointed by the ending. I was somebody who loved the way they ended it. For me, it was just like, I didn't really know how I felt about the movie's pacing. It felt like it was constantly switching between characters and stuff, and it just felt a little bit all over the place. And I don't have that thought anymore. When I watch it now, it actually feels very well paced. It's cutting at good moments, and it always works whenever it happens. And, you know, for a film that brings together all of these characters we've known for the past decade, it does it so well. Seeing, you know, all these characters from, like, you know what, like 18 different movies or something like that coming together, it was great. It worked so well. You know, they were all given, you know, their moment to shine. I don't think, like, you know, certain characters got enough screen time. I wanted to see a lot more Captain America personally, but, you know, still, he had his shining moment. I love when, you know, he first appears and when him and Black Panther are just running with each other, taking on all those aliens. That was an epic moment. So this movie just gave us all these characters and put them into all these epic scenarios. Obviously, you have Thanos as the best MCU villain and probably the, like, second or third best comic book villain of all time, in my opinion, like, movie-wise. Just coming into this film and being badass. I mean, he has the most screen time in this movie. This is a Thanos film, you know, and he wins. He wins. He kills, like, the majority of our characters that we love. So, great ending. Obviously, it's going to be reversed in Endgame. Question is, how? I cannot wait for Endgame, personally. I think it's going to be a fantastic movie, and it's almost out. Literally. Over a month, like just over a month, and Endgame will be out. I can't even believe I'm saying that. Like, just release another trailer, Marvel. There you go, guys. That is my ranking of the MCU movies. This was a very, very long video, recorded over the course of 2 days. So yeah, again, if you guys disagree, that is completely fine. I want to hear your rankings. Like I said, just be polite about it. Don't argue with each other in comments. Thank you all for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Because I love the banter between the two of these in this, between